Hello and welcome to Science from Today, Wednesday, May 15th. So today we first off reviewed those disease types that we talked about yesterday. Infectious diseases are the diseases that you can catch from somebody else, usually by a virus or bacteria or a single-celled organism. And a deficiency is a disease that's caused because you don't have enough of something, like a iron deficiency causes anemia, a vitamin C deficiency causes scurvy. And then cancer, we talked about how that is caused by a mutation in the genes that tell your cells to undergo mitosis and to stop undergoing mitosis. And then finally, this big kind of lumpy congenital slash hereditary. These are diseases that you get because of your parents, is kind of generally what I'm calling that, or at birth, you're born with them. So today, we went in a little more detail about congenital diseases, and I broke them down into three main classes: the chromosomal disorders, hereditary conditions, and diseases caused in utero. And go ahead and pause and see if you can connect each one of these. And actually, unpause for a second, sorry. I put a picture of a person that is suffering from one of these three uh, types of diseases or disorders. This girl has Down syndrome. That's Stephen Hawking, and he has ALS. And this guy has cerebral palsy. So see if you can figure out which one of those is which one of these three types of conditions and maybe what the difference is. So go ahead and pause it and answer that question of the day. And now that you're unpaused, you can go ahead and I'll tell you that Down syndrome is the chromosomal disorder. I'm going to get my little pointer pen here. Down syndrome is the chromosomal disorder. It's when you have one too many chromosomes, so 47 total. We'll talk today about how that happens. And then Stephen Hawking has a hereditary condition called ALS, which means that he received it from his parents' DNA. And then this guy has cerebral palsy, which was caused in utero, most likely. You can actually have this after you're born too. But what probably happened is he was deprived of oxygen, whether that was while he was in the womb or during birth or maybe sometime shortly after birth. And it caused some problems with how his brain communicates to his muscles via the nerves. Um, and we're not really going to talk too much about these types of diseases. Fetal alcohol syndrome is another example of some type of syndrome or disease that you can have because of a problem that happened in development, but it's not a genetic problem. So let's say he goes on and has kids. Those kids have just as good of a chance of having cerebral palsy as any other children that one of you guys might have. So we're going to spend more time talking about chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome and then hereditary conditions like ALS. And before we do that, I want to talk a little bit just about human and chimp DNA, actually. This is a picture that compares the 22 chromosomes of humans, so the H's for humans, versus chimpanzees. And then obviously the X and Y are the sex chromosomes. So I want you to just take a look at this picture and see what looks similar or what looks dissimilar. And see if you can find the one big difference between humans and chimps. So the big difference is on chromosome number 2. You'll notice that humans have a very large chromosome 2 and chimps have two smaller chromosomes 2. So we actually think is that at some point in human evolutionary history, we maybe had two smaller chromosomes that fused into one larger chromosome. So what that means is that chimpanzees have in a haploid sperm or haploid egg cell, because their two is split into two smaller ones, they've actually got 24 chromosomes in each egg or sperm cell, which means a diploid chimp would end up with 24 chromosomes. Sorry, a diploid would end up with 48. I misspoke there. 48 total chromosomes, whereas humans obviously have 46 for a diploid human. The reason I wanted to talk about that was just to talk a little bit about fertility and sterility. We'll use the example of a mule for that. So if you've heard of a mule before, you know that they are not naturally occurring in the sense that you have to make a mule from mating one horse with one donkey, and that gives you a mule. And they are not, they are sterile. They cannot have children, and that's because of their chromosome numbers. So horses have 32 chromosomes in a haploid sperm or egg, and then donkeys have 31 chromosomes in a haploid sperm or egg. So what that means is a diploid cell for horse is 64, a diploid cell for donkey is 62, and when that 32 and 31 from the egg and the sperm of the horse and donkey come together, it gives you a diploid cell for the mule of 63 chromosomes. Now, when the mule tries to make its own sperm or egg, it's going to have difficulty getting the right numbers in there, so that's why we say that the mule is sterile, because it can't split up the numbers of chromosomes correctly, which is a little bit kind of what happens with Down syndrome and some of the other chromosomes. So, chromosomal disorders. These chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome, you don't get them because your parents had them, so you don't inherit them, and you don't acquire them in terms of catching them, so you're not at risk of getting Down syndrome from somebody else. They happen because of a mistake during anaphase in meiosis, and it's something called non-disjunction. Just to break that word down a little bit, junction means kind of coming together. Disjunction means coming apart. And then non means not coming apart. So it's when in anaphase the chromosomes are supposed to break up. So here's the diagram right here. Chromosomes are supposed to split apart to both sides, but they don't do it. This is the proper way over here. They don't, and so you get 2 chromosomes in one cell and 0 chromosomes on the other. And we call that monosomy if you have one too few, or a trisomy if you have 1 extra, so a total of 3 of that pair of chromosomes. And this page is a little more detail on what's going to end up here. So this is correct meiosis that you want those chromosomes to line up in the middle of the cell in metaphase, so they're going to go ahead and line up, and there they go. So you could have non-disjunction happen when they're supposed to get pulled apart here, but accidentally 2 of them stick together. Or you could have that process happen here in meiosis 2 when these chromosomes are going to line up in metaphase again. So here they are lining up in metaphase. Now non-disjunction would be if both of those got dragged to the same side of the cell, which would give you 1 too many or 1 too few in the resulting zygote. So notice all 4 of these sperm are made correctly. These 2 eggs are made correct, that they should have 1 chromosome in each. This egg ends up with 1 too many. This egg has no chromosome. So it gives you trisomy and monosomy right there. Okay, so Down syndrome. Down syndrome is when you get trisomy 21. So notice down here, you've got 3 total copies of the 21. So that was in the process of meiosis. Either the mother's or father's DNA stuck together, the chromosomes stuck together when they were getting pulled apart in anaphase, and the zygote ended up with those 3 chromosomes. Kids with Down syndrome, they have short attention spans, low IQs, on average about 50. Their IQ is about 50 instead of the average of 100. They're impulsive. They've got increased risk of heart, gland, vision, and hearing disorders. And we're going to talk just a little bit about the cause of that, or kind of more risk factors, rather. So take a look at this graph. Maybe pause the video and take a look at this graph and see if you can understand what it's asking you. Let me move this, stop moving it so you can see the x-axis. So there's a risk factor for getting Down syndrome. Go ahead and pause and see if you can interpret that graph. Okay, and then unpause. And what that should have told you is that the older the age of the mother, the greater the risk of that child having Down syndrome. Particularly after age about 35 or so is where there's a really great risk of the mother having a child with Down syndrome, and that's because these chromosomes, they're all sitting there in the ovaries. Those eggs are sitting there in the ovaries, and the chromosomes are stuck together, and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. And when you ovulate an egg that is 35, 40, 45 years old, there's a better chance that its 2 chromosomes are going to get stuck together because they've just been together for so long. So Down syndrome more likely in older moms because those eggs have a greater chance of getting the chromosomes stuck together. And it's not really a risk for the father. So you could have an old dad because those sperm get regenerated every few weeks or so. As they die, they just get replaced over and over. So there's not as much of a chance that the men can still contribute to Down syndrome, and that the sperm could be the non-disjunction sperm, but it's less likely than happening in a woman. Okay, and the last thing we talked about was the ethics issue with Down syndrome. So you can, right now, if you do IVF, you can do a chromosomal screening of your embryos, and you can choose to not implant any embryos that potentially have Down syndrome. And you can also do tests for Down syndrome. After about 10 weeks, so 2.5 month mark, you can start testing the amniotic fluid of a woman who is pregnant, and if they have 47 chromosomes, so if they've got that extra number 21, then you know that that child will develop with Down syndrome. So in Iceland, which the story is about, 0% of the children in Iceland are being born with Down syndrome right now because either none of those embryos are being implanted or all of the fetuses are being aborted. I can't tell you whether that's right or wrong. That's something that if you wanted to write an essay about that and research that a bit, that would be an interesting topic for you to look into. And this story is just about that same thing, the fact that the rates of Down syndrome in some of the mostly Nordic countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland are decreasing. Edwards syndrome is another chromosomal disorder. It's trisomy 18. You've got 3 copies of that. Here's some of the symptoms of Edwards syndrome. And usually kids with Edwards syndrome die within just a few years of life, maybe 3 years old or so. And the last chromosomal disorder for the autosomes, the normal first 22 chromosomes, is Patau syndrome. And that's trisomy 13. So this child has cleft palate in addition to some cognitive brain issues and other issues. So those are the 3 autosomal chromosomal disorders. That means they're chromosome number 1 through 22. And there's a number of sex chromosome disorders. Turner syndrome is the first one. Linda Hunt is a famous person with Turner syndrome. Notice she's really short. That's one symptom of Turner syndrome, is that you don't attain puberty. You've got some heart problems, and typically they are infertile, which should make sense. Kind of like the mule, they're missing one of their sex chromosomes, so they're going to have 45 total chromosomes, which creates some problems during meiosis. Klinefelter syndrome is XXY, which means in addition to having 2 X's, which you think would make you develop as a female, you also have a Y. So the body's kind of getting some conflicting instructions as far as how to develop. People with Klinefelter syndrome are taller, they've got longer limbs, bad teeth, which leads to tooth decay, lack of facial hair, their genitals typically aren't fully developed, and they do have breasts as well, or some partial breast development. And this is, I didn't put it on here, but they are all also sterile. I wouldn't use the word infertile because they develop male genitalia. And it's not known for sure, but some people think that George Washington had Klinefelter syndrome because he is tall. He's got long limbs. If you remember the stories, he had wooden teeth, so his teeth got really decayed. No beard on George Washington. And he also never had children, which some people think is because maybe he was sterile, and which would make sense if he's got 47 total chromosomes. We also just looked at triple X syndrome, so that's just an extra copy of the X, which can create some kind of varying kidney problems and just developmental disorders. So that is triple X. Tomorrow we are going to start talking about hereditary diseases. And kind of the last thing I want you to take away is that these chromosomal syndromes, they are caused by your parents in the sense that you got it because of a mistake with your parents' DNA in meiosis, but you don't get them because your parents had them. So typically, yes, if somebody with Down syndrome reproduced, they could have offspring with Down syndrome, but usually kids with Down syndrome are born to 2 parents without Down syndrome because of this mistake during meiosis. That's different than what we'll talk about tomorrow, hereditary disorders. you get these from your parents because they were either carriers or they were afflicted with these various diseases. The first one we'll talk about tomorrow is achondroplasia, which is dwarfism in humans, and it's what gives us mini dachshunds and other animals like corgis. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Have a lovely dive. Oops.